Welcome to the History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here's your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham, coming at you today nearly live from Ottawa, Ontario. Great show for you today because we're talking about the prairies. One of my favorite things to talk about. Longtime listeners of the show will know that I had the chance to live in Regina for a couple of years. I have a master's degree from the University of Regina, and I had never been to the prairies before I went to Regina. And one of my favorite stories that I like to tell about my time out there is the first day when I flew out, because the city is surrounded by prairie, of course, and the airport is right on the edge of the city. And when you're landing at the Regina airport, one side of the plane, if you're looking out the window, you can see the city. The other side of the plane, you just see prairie. And I happened to be on the side of the plane that day that was just looking at the prairie. And having never been there before, I'm there to move into the residence at the University of Regina, and the plane is getting lower and lower and getting ready to land, and I'm sitting there thinking, where's the city? But over time, I learned to love that space that was outside the city. There's just something about the sky on the prairie. You know, Saskatchewan license plates say land of the living skies, and it's so true. There's something just powerful about the sky in the prairies. It makes me feel incredibly small, and I mean that in a really positive way. It just gives such scale to everything, and there's really nothing quite like watching a storm roll in from the west when you're out on the prairie. So I love the region. It was certainly good to me. Lovely people. I enjoyed my time out there. So whenever there's a chance to talk about life on the prairie, I am always interested in doing so and excited to do so. And today we're talking about a new book entitled Crown Ditch and the Prairie Castle, Bedlam in the West by Kyler Zeleny. And this is a really fascinating book. It is based off of Kyler's travels through the prairie. He's from the prairie, but for 4 years he traveled around documenting what life was like on the prairie as the region undergoes a massive shift. You know, rural depopulation, corporate agriculture coming in. There's just a lot of change going on in the prairie right now. In the book, using primarily photographs, profiles that change. So it's a wonderful project. Kyler was nice enough to come on the show to talk about the book and his experience on the prairie. So without any further ado, here is that conversation. Okay, and Kyler Zeleny joining us today from the prairies. Hi, Kyler. How are you today?
I'm doing all right. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for taking the time to join me today to talk about the book. And let's get right into it, because this is a subject that I certainly have a soft spot for. As I said in the intro, I loved my time living on the prairie, but most of my time out there was spent in the city. Didn't get out to the rural areas, the small towns very much. But I'm curious just to know, what was the impetus for this project? Why did you want to go out and document these places that so many folks across the country don't have a chance to go see for themselves?
Yeah, well, that's a long answer, actually. So it starts, about 10 years ago. So I was looking to do a master's program, and I ended up doing one in London, UK. And the course title, I was looking for something that took critical writing or sociology and mixed it with photography. And there's kind of like a very niche space where you can do this. And Goldsmiths in London was one of those places. So did this course, and the title of the course was Photography and Urban Cultures. And so a lot of the concepts were about looking at the urban, what's so important about the urban, et cetera. And I really kind of realized that a lot of the conversation when we actually do like spatial studies or like urban studies, we don't actually look at the opposite, which would be rural studies. Like when we think about space, we think about it often in terms of like, or it's discussed in more city-based kind of language. So when a lot of people were like kind of in the program looking at urban centers, I was kind of going through this process of being away from home because I'm a prairie boy, born and raised on a farm outside of a small town, an hour away from Edmonton. So pretty rural, like as rural as it gets. And I was just kind of fascinated by the idea of like looking at where I came from and where I was at that moment in life, and thinking that, like we should be thinking more about rural space. So that was kind of the beginning of it, and that started a project, and then from there that became a book, and then it snowballed into a PhD. And one of the outcomes from the PhD has been this book called The Crown Ditch and the Prairie Castle, which is a artist monograph, essentially just a photo book with a couple essays in the back. But it kind of all started with just trying to understand my place, I guess, in the whole scheme of prairies and prairie living. And it was kind of also embedded in this idea that like no one seems to be caring about this space. But also, when I'm 18 and I'm internalizing why I want to leave, because the idea was when you're 18, you just get out. You get out of Dodge. You leave town. Like you go to somewhere because that's what making it looks like, or that's what progress looks like. And that's kind of a narrative that we've been told really for over 100 years in terms of small town living, is the idea of to make it, you have to leave. And that's become more and more true and more embedded in the ideology. So a lot of youth just leave automatically, and that's what I did. But there's a lot of things that are great about like being in small towns and being in rural areas. And there's, like we can talk about that later, but there's definitely some pluses to it. But I thought it was interesting that there's this oscillating narrative of like good and bad, of how being in the rural can be a very negative thing, backwater, rednecky, and then how it could be a very positive thing where you have a sense of community and space and connection to the land. So I was interested in looking at those things, and it's been 10 years and continue to do it.
Well, it's this interesting dynamic, right? That, 200 years ago, maybe even 100 years ago, that to become wealthy and to make it, to use that term again, people would go to the land. Right? You would go out, you would set up a farm or homestead or something, and that was considered making it, and that was where a lot of wealth was coming from. And now, over the past, certainly the past 25 years, and probably much longer than that, we have seen this rural depopulation where to make it, people are going into urban centers. And that's also coupled with what seems to me from an outsider's perspective, the corporatization of farming in this country at least. And it's this interesting way in which the whole thing has been completely flipped on its head, because when, as I've done in my job looking at national historic figures, so many of them became wealthy by going west and engaging in land speculation. And now it's just the complete opposite, like you say. And it seems to me that, again, from an outsider's perspective, some of the soul of the rural parts of the country has kind of been taken away because of that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it was Margaret Atwood or maybe Jody Berland, who's an academic based in Toronto. I can't remember which it was, if it was the writer or the academic. One of them essentially said, if you actually looked at the writing on Canadian space or Canadian nationalism, you wouldn't think that 80% of individuals live in cities, because it's so rural based. We're so focused on this narrative of coming from the land. And yeah, I mean, that's a great point. So interesting. Coming from the old world to the new world, the way to make it was to break ground on a farm and prove that land, prove that 80 or 160 acres. And then it's almost like as soon as that happened, and a little bit of accumulation occurred and you started getting a few more acres, you started getting the next generation saying, what's after this? What's the next adventure? What do we move on from? So now that when I think about the whole system of colonizing the prairies, I think of like homesteading and farming is just kind of one of those steps. Like the mass farming, mass immigration to the prairies was really just about putting a base in place so that we could start to have larger cities and larger industrial spaces. And then we can kind of say, because they're a middle space and middle point, we don't need them anymore. And I think you're absolutely correct. Like 100% mechanization of farming on such a scale that we've never seen before. There's like land grabbing, where there's people are actually speculating on land. This is happening a lot in, like, even around Regina, in Saskatchewan, in Winnipeg, where you get corporations or hedge funds that are buying up giant pieces and parcels of land. And more recently, there's 3 farms that amalgamated. This is somewhere in Winnipeg. And I think they had the cost of land that they were selling when they were going to, get out of farming at $57 million.
Wow.
Just incredible. Like, 1,000 plus, like thousands of acres was being sold for this. They had these large families that had become corporations in themselves had kind of pulled together, and then they decided to sell $57 million. Like, they're just the economics of trying to be a farmer. And my dad's a farmer, so is my grandfather, and I help them in harvest when they need the help. And, they asked when I was younger, like, why do you want to get into farming? What about farming? They were never too pushy about it, but I think you could tell it was an intergenerational occupation that we had, right? So they were some interest in having me take that on. And I would just kind of lay it out. It was like, this is what the cost of land is. This is what machinery is. Like, it's big business. Farming is not for the entrepreneurial, grease-soaked hand kind of guy that thinks he can just fix it and do it all himself. Like, this is a really complicated operation now. And people really don't give farmers enough credit for the amount of ingenuity and, I don't know, just going through circumstance and being able to continue to want to try to make a living off the land. It's tough. So, yeah, the spirit of the prairies right now is kind of a little tumultuous. I think we're starting to see this switch, and small town farming is not really viable anymore at all.
Yeah, well, you kind of sense it whenever you see interviews with farmers that they have this stereotypical farmer almost drawl to them, the way that people speak, like that very stereotypical way in which you would expect a farmer to speak. When the CBC goes and finds somebody to interview, they sound like that, but the words that are coming out of their mouth could be coming out of the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, right? They're talking about the margins on certain products, the market variability, the trade
futures
dynamics,
markets.
The futures markets, all these things, like the sophistication that the business sophistication that goes into any sort of farm. And again, there's a romance that certainly people in the city have, I think, because so many people now have little urban gardens, and they think that, well, I grew some cucumbers and some zucchini and some cherry tomatoes. A farm is just a upscale version of that. Like it seems like there's, and I certainly can't speak to the connection between urban and rural, but there seems to be such a disconnect between the two, at least in my anecdotal experience of living in the city and just not really having a good sense of where agriculture is, where rural communities are in the country, and except for those interviews where I'm amazed at the business acumen of so many of these farmers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's common, really. There is this concept of like agritourism where you try to it's essentially getting urban folks to come out to the rural areas. And I'm definitely a rural advocate. And, I from looking at rural culture and photographing and writing about it, I've gone to, a fair share of demolition derbies, and I've been to, a rodeo here and there and a powwow there. And I try to get some of my city friends to come out and like, guys, like let's just like come spend a weekend, like even a day. Let's go and check out this demolition derby in this small town. Let's just experience that, because I think it's a good experience in general. And I mean, I'm deriving value from it, but I think you guys can too. And it's really difficult to get anyone to really be that interested in that. And I mean, like the competition of our time for entertainment purposes is it's really difficult. I mean, do you really want to be going to a small town and checking out a rodeo when maybe you can just go to the lake and relax? And I feel like that's like what urban individuals want to do with their free time is probably not spend it, going on a bison farm and right. touring and seeing how that operation works. Although I think that they should, but I can't, in the same way I think everyone should be educated about voting, but right. We're going to find a number of people that aren't going to do that. So I mean, there's definitely there's very, very few eyes from the urban spaces or spheres looking into the rural and trying to understand the rural. And I think, if we're not too careful about that, and if we don't continue to try to find some sort of bridge, especially if these communities start to become less viable as communities, as functioning communities, then we might have some real animosity, and we might have some sort of like discontent. And that kind of shows up a little bit in voting patterns and the idea of conservatism in rural areas. But I think rural individuals, and the same, like maybe if we're going to make the comparison to like how the West in general feels towards the East, Western Canada, which is a largely rural space. Like even talking about Saskatoon, that is still a rural city, still a prairie city. And there's like certain things about it that feel prairie. But yeah, if we're not too careful about this, it's going to breed some sort of division. And that's one thing that I'm become more and more focused on is how do we, in a general sense, as like almost like a political philosophy, is how do we just bridge more conversations and just listen to each other and dialogue, as opposed to running to the poles of left versus right.
I think that's a really good point, because yeah, that disconnect can be so damaging, and the possibility of animosity, you're already seeing it in certain pockets of the country and towards other pockets of the country, and it's definitely unhealthy because we're all basically on the same team, right? Everyone wants the same things out of life for the most part, with some variations, but everyone wants to be healthy and happy, and be secure, be able to provide for themselves and their family, and that those things are universal. And where you live, urban, rural, east, west, whether you're right, left, like those things don't come into play in terms of the needs that you have. So in going through and doing the book and putting it all together, what did you find in these communities? What are the concerns of the people who are still there, who are living there, and what are they looking at in the future in terms of some of the big challenges facing the prairies?
Yeah, I think I have phrased it this way. The prairies is kind of a space that looks back. So they're really focused. I think they're interested in trying to understand what the future can bring for them. I don't know if they have the best kind of solution. And I think a lot of the time we ended up going back, and it becomes in the same way that we do it for like Canadian writers write about the rural or nature in Canada, is this like place of nostalgia. And another word for it would, it's like heritage building. I think a lot of people, like I had tons of conversations. It was all about going to towns, photographing people, places in towns, and also like the landscapes. That was the three kind of components. So actually chatting with individuals was a big part of the project, and just listening to them. And I think a good number of them are kind of largely indifferent to this whole conversation. I don't think, at the end of the day, they're people living their lives. And I don't know how much they've really thought about what depopulation looks like, and what happens when a certain grant doesn't, come up the year after, or gets, defunded by the provincial or the federal government, things like that. But then you did find like a certain number of people that were really on it about the changes taking place within rural spaces. And they always had like this little bit like tinge of alarmist in them. Like they kind of saw what was occurring and what was coming. And a number of people started to even talk about this idea of like planned obsolescence, where there was political bodies, you can use called the federal government maybe, was purposely doing things to make the rural areas less viable. And there are like actually a number of instances that I've even anecdotally kind of come across where I actually think that's occurring. But you can't really say if it's planned because we have a hate on rural culture, or because it's really hard to operate a school when you only have maybe 7 or 8 people in the upper grades, like it's just not feasible. It doesn't make sense economically. But there are a couple things that were being done that also didn't make sense economically to kind of defund these spaces. So I think that's like this general fear, like people just don't want to see drastic changes to their lifestyle. I think there's a lot of people that really enjoy living out in rural spaces, and they want to continue to see those spaces be viable and vibrant. And I think a lot of communities are really just trying hard to also just retain youth, and it's an impossible task. So when I started, the PhD is about looking at like visualizing the prairies and like what is the idea of the region and how does it look, and throwing some images with space and place and history concepts, mashing them together and making a document of this place. But it initially was kind of about how can we make communities more viable? And very quickly I realized that sounds like a terrible, it would be like a great PhD thesis, but I also just sound like a terrible undertaking because I can't think of how en masse you can save small towns. I don't know what you can really do, just the way that we're kind of headed into the 21st century, the way individuals want to live, the access and amenities they want to have. I don't really know how you can keep a lot of small towns viable. Maybe you have some ideas.
Well, it's tough, right? Because when you think about some of the political decisions that get made, they're made with politicians, and this is a complaint I have of politicians, that so many of them are career politicians, that the focus is on how do I get reelected, right? That's such a focus of politicians today is looking towards the next election. And given that there is this disconnect between urban and rural spaces, and urban populations don't seem to pay much attention to rural populations, investing in rural areas doesn't provide a political uptick. There's no benefit politically to doing it because the votes are so central in the urban spaces, particularly urban spaces in Ontario and Quebec, that providing some sort of resource or investing in rural spaces in the West just doesn't have that political benefit to it. Therefore, the parties, all of them, are less inclined to do it. Like even a party that has a lot of support in the prairies, they're probably going to have that support anyway, right? When you look at the other parties, the other options that are available. So there just isn't there isn't the political power or the political might in these regions that perhaps they used to have. And I think that's a large part of it, that there's nothing pushing on the politicians, because the populations in these locations are smaller than urban spaces, and the urban spaces, particularly the ones in the east, don't have much of or they're not front of mind. I don't want to be so callous as to say that people in urban spaces in the east don't care about farmers, because I don't think that's entirely true, but they're not a political issue for people in these places, and therefore people in Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal aren't pushing for policies that are supportive of farmers, which is dangerous in that if we lose agriculture and turn it over to these large companies that control just vast swaths of the prairies, that is dangerous, because that's where so much of the food that we eat comes from. If we didn't have farmers, I would be dead in a month. Right? I can't sustain myself. So, it's really dangerous. And I think it's something that, and maybe I'm biased in that I lived in the prairies, again, in an urban space in the prairies, but you just seeing the scale, the size of it, and the amount of pride that is taken by people involved in the agriculture industry and just in small towns in general. It's really overwhelming, and it's something that, as somebody, again, living in a city in the east, I don't want that to go away. It's such a valuable part of what this country is, and part of it is the romantic cultural heritage that we all like to envision, but there's also a very real practical economic benefit to ensuring that these places are viable and people want to continue to live there.
80% of Canada's population is urban-based, right? So just going back a little farther in the conversation, I think whenever you have a group that is larger, they're going to have more power often, right?
Sure.
And that group is going to kind of dictate terms. And that's essentially what's happening regionally. It's on point, I think that's also a little bit of what I was trying to do with my work. It was kind of twofold. It was about giving a space, the prairies, that doesn't really have a lot of visual culture. There's not really a lot of photographers that are kind of looking at this large area. or the region.
Right.
So giving some sort of document where this is kind of like we can start to build our visual culture a little better. So that was part of it. And the other thing was kind of external. So essentially, how can we get people to like put some eyes on Prairie Spaces, and how do we like kind of put the focus back onto this area that, I mean, one of the reasons that it's not often discussed in media, or it's not really on the radar of everyone, is because it's not sensationalized, right? I mean, it's a very slow process going from a 1 kilometer section with X number of farmers to it having one farmer and being owned by a corporation, right? And this is also super important because we saw this with the meat industry in Western Canada, is when you collectivize these spaces and turn them into large factories and industries, then our food security is significantly in jeopardy. And we actually saw this with COVID. There was a butchering plant in, I think it was High Level or High River, Alberta, that does a significant portion. There's like 3 places that slaughter pigs in, I think, Canada, and they do about 90% of all the volume. So what happens when one of those plants, we have to go back to a small scale, I think, in animal husbandry and also farming, so either grain or cattle farming. And when we don't do that, we just become farther and more disconnected from our food supply chain, and it becomes like a real food issue. Like, we have abundance, but we also have really complicated systems that are required to continue to move in order for that abundance to continue to exist for us.
For sure. And you see it too with potatoes right now, right? There's too many potatoes. And with restaurants shut down, I know they're starting to open up, but people, and there's certainly an issue in PEI that they just had too many potatoes. And
I didn't know about
this. There's too many potatoes. They want us to eat all the potatoes because we have so many potatoes that just aren't going through the same commercial format or the commercial enterprising that would normally take place. So that again is a problem, that everything gets centralized within these 1 or 2 large companies, and then something goes wrong and this element of the food chain goes away. Or at the same time, I know it's not a Canadian example, but with red onions, the company in the U.S. had to recall red onions. And again, if all these products are coming through one source or 1 or 2 sources, when you have something like that happens, that creates a huge ripple that could have major impact on public health. And then you also have environmental issues, because these large-scale corporate farmers, or farming corporations, I should say, aren't organizations with the greatest of track records environmentally. There was a study last year that said large-scale commercial, like corporate farming of soybeans, is worse for the environment than small-scale, like free-range beef production, which sort of goes against the narrative of eating plant-based stuff. But if the plant-based stuff is being farmed in an irresponsible way, so all of these things just point to smaller scale farming being a better way in terms of food production, environment, economically. There's just so many benefits to these types of processes, and ensuring that these places are viable, that it goes well beyond the people who live in these spaces. If it all goes away and turns into corporate agricultural space, and that's all the prairie is, that's going to have a huge ripple effect for the people in the cities, which is why it should probably be a political issue.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like, I'd wave my hand and be like, yeah, that's an issue. I've seen that for a while. But to get other people to get on board with that and put that at you need a significant amount of hindsight even to be able to politically plan for that, right? And it's just like, who's going to care in this climate right now? With a lot of protests, with COVID, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of changes, even just, how can you be like, oh yeah, like just so you guys know, the rural farmer is also in danger, and we should probably talk about him. I can just see a lot of people saying, why the fuck would I care right now? Like, there's bigger things afloat, right? And it's but yeah, I mean, like we're seeing a breakdown of a system, and I think what the real issue is, once we could just use one small community as an example. Once a small community kind of hits this tipping point of being functional to no longer being viable, there's really no coming back. I can't imagine. I mean, I've probably been to 200 communities, rural communities under the size of 10,000. The ones that are in, above 2,000 generally are going to do quite fine. But most, about 160 I've been to, are under 1,000 for population.
Wow.
And you can see that there's a point within those communities where it's a flip of a coin, really. If 5 years from now, that community will be viable. And one community that's just directly north of where I'm from is called Andrew. And 10 years ago, it was vibrant and it was bumping. They built a new school. They had tons of businesses. It seemed like it was going to do fine. And if you drive through that community today, you would be amazed. These are also aging spaces, right? So without youth influx, which it's hard because there's no jobs, very few jobs. And I think the writing's kind of on the wall for a number of communities, and there's really no saving them. And then once they go past that point, there's no bringing them back, because I haven't seen a community that was looking pretty dire and was able to revitalize itself, to have some sort of resurgency as a community where people would want to live. And once utilities and facilities and amenities start to kind of dwindle, it's kind of, to the grave for these places, from the gravel and the dirt that, they started as, from then to pavement, back to gravel, then to dirt,
Right. Well, it's like, if there's no schools and kids have to travel to go to school, and then they don't want to stay in the community. But on the other end, if you don't have hospitals or doctors, then older people are going to have to move where they're closer to medical facilities too, right? And so if the only people who can live in these towns are between the age of 20 and 60, that's kind of a problem.
Yeah, and I mean, I go to a lot of the events in my hometown just over the years, because I'm like, the next project I'm working on is actually looking specifically at my hometown of Mundare. And, we do a number of functions and events, and you can see the population for those events is dwindling. I think, I've kind of pointed to that, where it's like, I think people would rather just go to the lake than hang around and see a small town parade they've seen for 20 years already, or 40 years. But I'm very cognizant of what age bracket that I exist in, and I look around and I'm like, I'm the only one around here that's in this age. There's, I don't know, maybe I'm looking at like 100, 150 people, and there's like 4 of us maybe that fit this. And that's demographically, I mean, maybe there are people residing in that community within my age group. I think there is, but they're not active and functional in the community in the same way that 20, 30 years ago they would have been. So I guess, and we could probably talk about community in more of a general sense. We're seeing a different type of community now. We're seeing it differently in rural spaces, but also urban spaces. So that's also not so much an urban-rural issue as it is maybe just a change in what contemporary living looks like. Although you'll still get people, in their 20s and 30s going to farmers markets in the city, but you'd be hard-pressed to find a farmers market and people in their 20s and 30s in small towns.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like, every week I walk past a farmer's market in Ottawa here down at Lansdowne Park, and you're right, the place is packed. People love the idea of it, and certainly in Ottawa here in the fall, and I guess in the spring too, but I think of it as a fall activity. People go out to the sugar bush. They have the set up where you can take like a wagon ride and see them tap all the maple trees, and you have lunch, and it's a thing. So that's a sort of a local thing here.
That sounds pretty fun.
It is. It can be a fun time, but again, that's sort of that agrotourism that you were talking about before, that doesn't necessarily lead to a long-term sustainable growth or just sustainability for
it's sporadic influx, really, and it doesn't work for every. You can't have, what was the name of it?
They do the sugar bush. The sugar bush,
yeah. You can't have. I mean, I can't imagine you can have like 100 sugar bushes, right? Like in the same way that you can't have like on the prairies 100 towns doing pumpkin growing contests, like like there's a real limit to agritourism. Tourism in general, for like, so I think, and that was one of the things that people like kind of talked about a little bit, was like, or we just need to like get a hook and invite people to our communities through some sort of like tourism. It's just like, if everyone's doing that, all these small towns, and you know, the supply is high, but the demand is staying the same. I mean, what's it all for? I mean, I don't think that's really the solution. It kind of happened with a lot of towns in started even in like the 70s and continues today, make these giant objects, which is kind of an interesting thing. It's a very prairie thing too, right?
Yeah.
I think they do it a little bit out east. They also do it in the United States in some areas, but the prairies, I think, is like the hot spot for, we want to make something giant, right? So our town, Mundare, has a giant 42-foot fiberglass sausage that is like a homage to the fact that there's a sausage making factory here that's really well known for its sausages. And you get to think like these weird icons of the prairies. And I mean, I think it draws people out. I mean, people stop, but I don't know who's driving. Like, you know, it's not like someone's like, hey, Vern, like, let's go in the car. We need to go to Mundare to like look at that giant sausage. Like, that's what we need to do right now. Like,
right. Yeah, it's like that Corner Gas episode where they want to build the world's biggest hoe. Right?
Yeah.
They have that idea, but and I think part of it is to proximity to the city, because these programs or these things are trying to draw in people who live in urban centers. So if you're 45 minutes from Edmonton, probably a little easier than if you're 4 hours from Edmonton.
Absolutely.
The opportunity cost, that it matters in the whole equation as well.
Yeah, and Mundare is like 45 minutes away from Edmonton, so you can still, even people that can live in the community and vice versa and commute. But like, there's also a number of communities near Calgary, like Nanton and Clare's Home. Those are really good examples of, they're really just relying on the draw of the city, and I think they'll continue to do quite well. And that's a place where you can have a distillery or an antique shop, and like, it's a cool shop. Like, it's kind of what you see in like, what's the apothecary store that's in Schitt's Creek? Like, that would never work in most small towns. Maybe in Ontario. And that's one of the things that's interesting about the concept of that series. I don't think they ever really discuss place, which I think is interesting, because I think they're trying to make it more universal and have that American appeal, but it's like ambiguous, like rural living. But that, like, the apothecary store that they like put would never work in so many small towns. Like, no way. Yeah. So it's a little dream. But I actually really like Corner Gas for how ridiculously accurate it is. And like, it still has like, it's such good comedy, but that's a really great show. But it is also very tropey, right? And
sure.
And tropes can be really good things. They can create nostalgia or create ideas, but then they can also be limiting, right? So stereotypes, not always a good thing, sometimes a good thing.
Right. I think another element of this that we've kind of touched on a bit that we should address, I think, again, and this is anecdotal from my experience in the city, but in the process of reconciliation, I do feel as though people who live in urban centers tend to think of reconciliation as a rural thing, and they think of land dispossession as rural as opposed to being just a complete nationwide thing. And I don't know if there's actually been anyone who's looked at the practical implication of whether or not this is true, and two, if there is any influence on how people view rural areas as a result of that. But that is the sense I get, that when urban people or people who live in urban centers think of a process of reconciliation, they don't think of the land where the city is. They think of rural space as part of that. And that's part of just a colonial thinking of how people tend to conceptualize indigenous peoples. But I do think that that's another way in which urban communities tend to separate themselves from rural communities. And I don't know how valid that is, but from my anecdotal experience in teaching here in Ottawa, that seems to be a way a lot of folks who live in cities think about rural space.
Yeah, I have very little experience with this topic, but I find that very fascinating. I mean, like, a lot of my colleagues and anyone I'm ever talking to that generally that's from a university will place in their email signature, like, located at campus X, which is part of, X territory. So there was always that, like, this acknowledgement and identifying of this space was collected and taken through this specific colonial process. But yeah, I think a lot of like the idea of like the settler, like colonial settler, is like I mean, if you think like, yeah, who has all the land? It's the settlers. It's not those living in cities that have, maybe one lot on a block.
Right.
So, I mean, in terms of the economics of it, it's probably more viable to start looking, if this was like to dispossess land and give land back, it would probably be something that would be rural. But I mean, we've already kind of seen how reserves work. Even like that was all a very shitty option to give them just really unprofitable and unproductive land so that we can use the productive land to do our thing. But it's still an interesting process where that's maybe not the most viable thing. Maybe they should start offering up city lots to individuals and groups and communities, which is, I don't know. The process, I have no idea, or an idea.
I think it's really just a case of acknowledging that the country, the political entity of Canada, is one that is based off of land dispossession of Indigenous peoples, and that is a coast to coast to coast reality. And as long as we have that as our starting point, then it'll actually, I think, allow for a better process of reconciliation as we move forward and rightly continue to move forward towards reconciliation across the country. I do also, I want to get back to something you talked about earlier, and you talked about the visual culture of the prairies. This is something, and this is by far the biggest thing that I've taken away from my time living in Regina. And I get into arguments with people all the time that the prairies are beautiful. I love the prairies. And to go back to Corner Gas, the first scene in this Corner Gas series is a guy pulls into the gas station. He says, the land, like Saskatchewan's really flat. There's nothing to see. And Brent comes out and he says, well, there's plenty to see. There's nothing to block your view. And this is an idea that I really believe in. And I know in Saskatchewan, the license plates, I assume they still say land of the living skies. And there is nothing as powerful to me as seeing a storm roll in across the prairies. It is just unbelievable to see it. And, you folks in BC and Alberta, take your mountains. You can have them. I don't care. Just enjoy them. You all like them. And one of the arguments that I've gotten in is just you can see forever, and that's great. And somebody said to me, well, if you go to the top of the mountain, you can see forever. And I said, yeah, but you have to climb to the top of a mountain to do it. On the prairie, I can just walk outside and do it. And when I've done the train across the country a couple times, everyone loves the mountains part, and the mountain part is beautiful. Don't get me wrong, Jasper is spectacular, but when you're in the middle of the prairie, I don't think there's anything quite like it in the world. So I think the visual culture of the prairies is so powerful. It makes me feel incredibly small to just see the sky. So
which is so interesting, because a lot of people would think of a rock face, a giant mountain, and be like, I feel small in comparison to this giant rock.
Right. It's just like the vast, like the ability to just see forever and see till you can't see anymore. That I love that part of it. And I don't know if I necessarily even have a question, but but when you think of the visual culture of the prairies, what comes to mind for you? Because for me, it's the sky and just the mass horizon. Yeah,
well, part of it's also disentangling it from what lies below the 49th parallel too, right? So
sure.
Or problematizing it, including some parts of what lies below, and grouping it into a wider region that doesn't have, there's no distinction with some imaginary border that we drew, right? Or some white guys, some white surveys drew like 200, 300 years ago, whenever it was fully drawn. But so the sky is such a key component, but it is also in other, like Montana talks about big skies as well. Alberta does. Yes. And I think anywhere in that Midwest would probably be like, they would, if you went into one of those bars and you said, I'm from Alberta or I'm from Saskatchewan, we have the biggest skies. I think some people might like I don't know, dart their eyes at you and be like, excuse me? I don't know about that one. But I don't think it's fighting words, but it's definitely like, what are you talking about? We have the big skies over here. So it is, I mean, you talked about like, yeah, you got to get to the mountain peak in the Rockies to be on top and to see the view. And you don't see actually in every direction too, because you have so many other mountain peaks that are also blocking just outside of the valleys, right? But on the prairies, I mean, one way to phrase it is every step you take is the peak, right?
Yeah.
It's also the valley, right? So I personally think that they're beautiful. I find, I lived, when I was doing my PhD in Toronto, like I'd take a couple drives out and, go from, take train or a car from, Toronto to either Montreal or Ottawa. And like, I found those drives claustrophobic, or those train rides claustrophobic.
They're brutal.
Because all I can see is trees on either side.
Yeah.
There's,
when you get close to the lake, if you're taking a Via Rail trip, you do get close to the lake for part of it, and that's kind of cool. But when you're just next to the 401, and so it's the 401 on one side and trees on the other, there's just nothing to look at.
No, it's not. It's not real great. I don't know, for me at least. Everyone has their landscape, but there's I don't know if I made this up or someone else did, but there's one guy that lives in the Rockies is standing next to a guy that lives in the prairies, and they're facing east, and they're looking at the Rockies, and past that's the prairies, and the guy from the Rockies is like, wow, isn't that beautiful? It's such a nice view. And the guy from the prairies is like, what do you mean? It's blocking the view, right? So it's I think one thing that I use the term banal, and not so much in like, there's a number of ways that term has been used academically. Like I think Foucault talked about it, Hannah Arendt talked about it, but just really banal in the same sense as like the everyday and ordinary. And I like to think that we have generally a visual culture that's very banal. Like we're kind of like the slightly, and going back to this, talking about this comparison with the United States, we're the slightly more boring America. And I think even visually, what I try to do is say, like, in my head, I was like, we're not. I'm going to go out and photograph how we have our own visual uniqueness and how photographically that can be perceived as beautiful. And I'd say probably I kind of failed on that, because I did prefer more photographing generally in the United States, actually, when I was in Montana or like Kansas or something. Like I just think there's something more visually aesthetic to the way that things are constructed and the materials that are used. I think we're just so banal north of the border that everything becomes like a mild replication of another town, essentially, because they're all built in like this really close succession and time period, right? And I don't know how you kind of like try to make that beautiful. I mean, through repetition, maybe that's one way, but one thing that this is like early on, was looking at my photos, and I've had this comment more than once. I don't really take these things negatively, but once someone says like, it looks like America, but just like a little tilted, like a little off. Like it seems American-esque. It's like if someone had to go report back to Europe and be like, this is what America looks like, it'd be like, that's kind of it, but not it. So I thought that was kind of interesting. We're just so similar, and we just rely so heavily on our southern neighbor for identity and ideas of what culture look like.
Well, I mean, especially in the way those areas were colonized, the process is very similar. And again, that the 49th parallel, it's an arbitrary marker between the two countries. So the relationship, and I think this exists across the country to a large extent, that the relationship north-south culturally is a lot more similar than it is east-west.
Yeah, absolutely.
People in Vancouver have more in common with people in Seattle than they do with people in Fredericton, just culturally. It's just it's the way it is.
Even people in like Calgary and Vancouver, Vancouverites, and I don't know if you call them Seattleites, but Seattle folk would be so much more. And I got that sense too when I was in Montana. It's like the geographical formations in North America run north to south or south north. Like they don't run east west really, right? So it's so much easier to see how industry and climate and like just even how things are spaced out how Alberta and Montana would be so much more on the same page than Alberta and dense Toronto or, dense Ottawa.
Yeah, and to get back to the colonization part of it, when you look at, not that I've done this extensively, but I've been involved in one project that looked at land uses by indigenous peoples prior to colonization, that the communities would go back and forth across the 49th parallel all the time.
Yeah.
And, and that seems to have taken place all across what are now the two countries. And so before that line was there, the people who were here for thousands of years were just going back and forth because naturally that is just the best way for communities to grow and to use the space.
Yeah, and I mean, if we're following bison or buffalo herds, we're following them specifically as they move, right? And they can move past that border. It wouldn't be very uncommon.
Yeah, as a farmer once said, as famously quoted about daylight saving time, it's the same with the border. Like, cows don't care where the border is. Like, cows are going to go where they're going to go, right? Same with bison, same with everything. They're just going to go. So I want to get you out of here on this. We've talked so much about the prairie and the culture of it and, the motivation of the book, but what is your goal or for readers? Like, when somebody gets this book, goes through it, what are you hoping that they take away from it?
Yeah, well, so I want to preface this by saying the book the photos plus the text is a narrative. It's a narrative of what prairie space and culture and the region is for me. So there are multiple narratives, which I think is important to kind of stress, especially now where history is really kind of being challenged. Canadian history, American history, in a real positive sense. So, but for me, this is just one of the many narratives. This is what I'd like people to get or take away from the project. It's one of the many narratives of what it is to be in the prairie region. That's it. This is just the way that I see the space. As, a white dude in his early 30s who has, farming and small town roots. It's just one of the narratives. And I think it's still an important one. I think we still need to continue to be a stronger region in terms of our visual culture. As a Canadian nation, I think we need to be a nation with stronger cultural cohesiveness and ties, or even just the cohesiveness of understanding the mosaic that it is and how different it is as a way to be cohesive in a telling of our nation and stuff. I think we rely too heavily on external ideals. There's this common trope within Canadian critical studies of peering over the fence to look south to try to understand who we are, right?
Yeah.
And I think we do that too often. So this is just one of those texts that is really just about, hey, this is a region that is a large part of the Canadian prairies, or is the Canadian prairies, or is a large part of the Canadian nation. We don't have a lot of text. We don't have a lot of visual work coming out of this area. This is just what one of them is, and I hope more will follow.
And yeah, we certainly encourage everybody to go get the book. Again, it is Crown, Ditch, and the Prairie Castle, Bedlam in the West. So Kyler, where can people find the book?
On the great internet. So if they go to the publisher's website, thevelvetcell.com, there's a link there, or I guess on my website too, kylerzeleny.com, and free in international shipping, which is pretty great.
Yes, nothing wrong with that, especially in this period where we're pretty much ordering everything. Not
online.
Everything. A lot of stuff is being ordered online. So free shipping, when you can get that, it's always a bonus. So Kyler Zeleny, congratulations on the book, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me. I love these chats, and I mean, this was for me pretty illuminating, so I enjoyed it.
So there you have it, my conversation with Kyler Zeleny. My thanks to him for taking the time to join me today. And again, the book is Crown, Ditch, and the Prairie Castle, Bedlam in the West. So definitely encourage you to check that one out. So that'll do it for this week's episode. Thank you to everybody for listening. If you have not yet, please do subscribe to the show wherever it is you get your podcasts. Do the ratings and the comments and all that stuff. It helps other people find the show, keeps us going here. So definitely would appreciate anybody who is listening and enjoys the show to go in and leave those comments, leave those ratings. It really helps us out. And also head on over to ActiveHistory.ca. We are in the midst of the summer, which is a bit of a slower season for us usually. Not quite as many posts, but the stuff that's there is really great stuff. So definitely head on over to ActiveHistory.ca and check out not only the written material, but also some of our past episodes. Last week we had Steve Marty talking about volunteerism during the First World War. If you're into the war stuff, the military history, we had Alex Suchin a few weeks ago as well. So just a lot of great episodes over the past few weeks as we continue to go on the weekly schedule through the pandemic, which hopefully doesn't last forever, but certainly I've enjoyed increasing the frequency of the episodes. Hopefully you've enjoyed them as well, and we're going to continue with the weekly schedule for the foreseeable future. So you'll want to subscribe to make sure you get all those episodes. So thanks again for listening. We will be back with you again next Thursday, but until then, if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Be sure to check out Active History for more features, articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.